low energy buildings ever since. And in 25 years ago, I was part of the team, the environment team, to produce a big renewable energy teaching pack for other universities to use, and then we turned it into a course. So that's been going for 25 years, and we reckon we probably educated about 10,000 students in renewables over that time.
Okay, and Stephen?
So good afternoon, everyone. I'm Stephen Peake. I'm Professor of Climate Change and Energy in the Faculty of STEM at the Open University. Derek's being quite modest. I mean, he was a true pioneer of the alternative technology group. There's a lovely photograph of one of the first test wind turbines to be put up in the UK, where the library stands now, although I think you all got told off when it came off in high winds and nearly hit a student, and the Vice Chancellor then bought you some land off campus to play with.
That's not quite correct, but we did actually test. I had built a test site on the OU campus, which I used in the 1980s to test various wind turbines, which I invented, including a V-type vertical axis turbine and Sycamore turbine. And we got quite a long way down the road, but unfortunately, at the same time, there's a big failure of one of the big government-funded vertical axis turbines. So, and at the same time, the price of oil came down, so we weren't able to progress it. But I think there's still possibilities.
Well, I like my version of that story, and I keep elaborating it every time I say it. That gets more and more exaggerated. But okay, so I mean, I've just published a book, a popular science book on renewable energy, which I will be just briefly showing you in a few slides in a few moments' time. So I'll hand over to Neil.
Hi, I'm Neil Edwards. I'm a professor of Earth System Science in the School of Environment, Earth and Ecosystems, and I work very closely with Phil, as it happens, on climate modelling, essentially, but we also model the global economy, so we run so-called integrated models that look at the climate and the economy and policies working towards net zero, for instance. So that's our interest.
Okay, thanks everyone. So I'll kick us off, or Stephen can kick us off. He's got some slides prepared on what do we mean by net zero. So I'll just have a go at sharing those.
Yes, it's interesting when you pop the phrase net zero into Google, and I suggest you do, and maybe just search on the images, just go on the image search. It's like a brand. It's become a kind of brand. It's net zero. Everyone's talking about it. We're going for net zero. We've adopted net zero. And actually, I think we probably all have an understanding of what the word zero means. But it's that word net, that adjective in front. It's a certain kind of zero. It's a net zero. And I want to kick us off today in this question about renewables and net zero by just reminding ourselves what it actually means. So I've done a little sketch which shows global greenhouse gas emissions on the vertical axis, as they roughly are now, about 50, 60 billion tons of carbon dioxide equivalents. That's adding up not just carbon dioxide, but the other exotic gases, which are greenhouse gases and are anthropogenic, that they're produced by human activities, the nitrous oxide, the methane, and the so-called industrial F gases. So you've got those gases, and what we've got to do across the rest of this century, in 80 years' time, is completely redesign our energy and agricultural systems so that the anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions from the 8, 9, 10, 11 billion of us over the course of the century, they collapse. And they collapse towards 10, 20 billion tons per year by the end of the century. And this particular sketch that I've done is one that was in the UK Climate Change Committee's report on net zero. And it's the one where we have a better than 50% chance of hitting a stabilization of global mean surface temperature of 1.5 degrees by the end of the century. So it's the kind of, Paris plus, if you like, Paris Agreement plus. So it's quite challenging. Now, what do we mean by net zero? Well, look at this graph. It has some positive emissions, 10 to 20 billion tons of positive emissions going into the atmosphere still by the end of the century. But in order to sort of make it sum up to zero, we've got to find some negative emissions technologies. We've got to find some things that will suck carbon and possibly other gases out of the atmosphere at an equivalent rate to those residual emissions that we're still pumping out. So if we still have to use certain fossil fuels in energy, or agriculture is still emitting these other gases, then we've got to compensate for that with these other exotic technologies. I mean, some of them are basic. Like trees absorb CO2, and if you can make sure that they do not release the CO2 again when they're burnt or whatever happens to them, that's one way. But they could be huge Dyson air fan suckers in the atmosphere, powered by renewable energy, sucking CO2 directly out of the atmosphere. So the challenge we face when we say net zero, we're all signed up to net zero. It is a real challenge, because we've got to, first of all, crush the fossil fuels that we are so dependent on and reduce energy, and then replace the fossil fuels with renewable energy. But at the same time, we've got to start investing in and developing these negative emissions technologies industry. So it's not trivial. It's easy to say. You can put it on your T-shirt, you can sign up to it, you can write it on a placard, but you cannot get away from the real technical, economic, political, and even philosophical challenges about really radically or rapidly redesigning our global economic system in a very short period of time. So if we go to the next slide. I have written a popular science book about renewables, which is 10 short lessons in renewable energy. My wife says to me, how do you know it's going to be popular? And I say, no, that's the genre. That's the genre. I think I've enjoyed writing it. I normally write textbooks with the OU, with Derek. You've got a little bit more license to be a little bit more flowery and try different ways of communicating. And I've enjoyed writing that book, and I recommend it to any of you who are interested. And the next slide, please, Phil. So one of the things that I was discovering when I wrote this book is just how much renewables are going to count in the future. And just in the next couple of decades, the IEA, the International Energy Agency, is predicting that for us to meet what they call a sustainable development scenario, and that is not as tough as the one I just showed you. That's a little less tough to achieve, a little easier to achieve. If you just look at where we get electricity from, at the moment, 26% of our electricity comes from renewables, but in just 20 years' time, it's going to be near 70%. So a major radical revolution just in electricity, and the same will be happening for the heat markets, which we have, which are slightly separately. So renewables are a massive part of our future and how we're going to actually stabilize global temperatures. And the next slide, please, Phil. Now, the good news is, and this is something else I discovered in writing this book, I took the IPCC's, one of the IPCC's reports. So this is official data, and the IPCC is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And they were musing in one of their reports, technically, how much could we how much could we get from renewable energy if we really went for it and invested in it? And a world watt is the total power consumption of the world at any time, right? It's everything that we're using right now, and it's the power, it's the energy per minute, per hour, per day. And currently, about 13% of everything that we're consuming right now, all 8 billion of us, is renewable. But just look at these figures. Just at the last column, a mid-estimate, the IPCC reckons that it's not out of out of the world, it's not science fiction, that we might be able to power 43 planet Earths as we are now, wasteful and poor design and all the silly things that go on in our economies. 43 planet Earths just from the solar, another 1.3 planet Earths from geothermal. Over half a planet Earth is powered from wind. Biomass can be a half a planet Earth. Ocean power systems, which we haven't invested in at all, really, a third of a planet Earth. And hydropower, large hydro, more or less saturated, it's providing about 10%. So altogether, just a middle of the road, not too optimistic, not too pessimistic assessment. Renewable energy could power 45 planet Earths, and that's 45 planet Earths as they are now, with all their waste, all their poor design, all their silliness that is embedded in our economies, because we just waste energy left, right, and centre. And I think that's the end of my intro slides, Phil.
Great, thanks. Great to finish on a nice positive note there as well, yeah. And pass on to Neil. Do you want to take us on for your...
Yeah, sure. Well, I was just going to say a bit more about what we do, Phil, which is, like I was saying, climate modelling. So a climate model is just like a weather forecast model, only kind of zeroed out and a bit fuzzy around the edges. So with a climate model, you might not be able to tell the difference between, say, Newcastle and London, and in our climate model, you might not even be able to tell the difference between France and Spain. It's just a bit sort of fuzzy, less resolution, effectively, is what we mean by that. And at the same time, as spatial resolution going down, the time resolution goes down, which is actually the difference between weather and climate. So weather is, the famous adage, climate is what you expect and weather is what you get. That basically is a pretty good definition of climate. And as you sort of get more and more fuzzy and lower the resolution, your grainy picture, you can look at longer and longer timescales. So we're actually interested in very long timescale climate change, like centuries, millennia, even longer. So we have an approximate view of climate, but we can look at climate change in the past. So for instance, we've just had an interesting paper come out looking at the changes in the monsoon over the last 30 million years. And we found that changes in the monsoon over the last 30 million years, the Indian monsoon, have been driven by the uplift of the Himalayas, which is what everybody has known for a long time, really, but also by changes in atmospheric CO2. And in fact, our modelling suggests that the CO2 changes have really quite a major effect. And if we were to double atmospheric CO2, as is potentially quite possible still, the change in the monsoon would be as great as any change that's happened in the last few million years. So that's the kind of thing we look at. But as I said earlier, we also look at the interaction between the climate and the economy. So we have relatively simple climate models, and we couple those with relatively simple economic models. But they're still pretty complex. They split the global economy up into all the different countries, well, a large number of countries, and lots of different sectors, 40, 50 different economic sectors and different fuels, and how all those economic sectors interact and trade the different countries, and what that economic activity ultimately means for emissions. And therefore, the point of all this is, what policies you can impose on the economies in all the different countries, policies on heating, on energy use, policies on vehicles, what incentives you give to people to switch to electric vehicles, for instance, and what the effect of those policies will ultimately be on emissions. And then we work out, is that going to fix the climate? So that's the kind of thing we get up to. And there are two very interesting questions that we've been looking at recently. And one is about the so-called transition risk. Now, that's to do with the effect on the economy of making this huge transition that Steve was talking about. So we know we have to make this massive transition. So to protect the climate, we need this total transformation of the economy to renewable energy, and that is a big change in the economy, and that affects jobs, it affects people's lives, it affects people's livelihoods, how we heat our houses, and all these things. And it's going to have a much bigger effect on people's lives in the next few decades than we've seen up to now, just changing the energy system. And when you turn on your light bulb, you don't see whether that power is coming from a windmill or burning coal. But the changes we need to make in the future, we're really going to see, and they involve, changes in what we actually do, how we travel, and so forth. So those changes have a big effect on the economy. Now, the question is that a good effect or a bad effect? Is there a risk that could actually lead to the kind of economic crisis that we saw, for instance, in the housing crisis in 2008? And it turns out that there is quite a significant risk that big change in the economy could have big impacts on the economy, as all the investments that people have been banking on in fossil fuels, billions of pounds are invested in fossil fuels and banked on fuel that's still underground at the moment, suddenly becomes effectively worthless or worth very little. So that's one thing we've been looking at. And another thing we've been looking at is one of these technologies for net zero. So how we can actually suck that carbon out of the air. And we're interested in we've been studying, part of a big project that's looking at a really interesting technology for that, if you can call it technology. And that's based on thinking about, well, what would the Earth system do on its own, left to its own devices, as it has been for billions of years, if you had a great pulse of CO2 in the atmosphere. And every few tens of millions of years that happens because of various natural processes, and the Earth stabilizes itself again. Unfortunately, it tends to take a few million years. So how does it do it? It essentially does it by chemical reactions between the CO2 in the air and the rocks, which are accelerated by plants. So plants cause the breakdown, the so-called weathering of rocks, and that reaction sucks CO2 out of the atmosphere. Now, the question is, we haven't got millions of years, so can we accelerate that and make that happen fast enough to actually be useful to draw down CO2? And the answer is, it's a big ask. It's tough, but it can be done. And how you do it is you crush up basalt rock to a powder and you spread it on agricultural fields. You have to do a heck of a lot of it, but it can be done, and it is a realistic technology. So that's one of many, sort of what I call a portfolio of technologies that may be employed in the future to help tackle climate change. And this particular one has another interesting feature, which is it helps restore damaged and weathered soils, which is a totally separate global problem, or, well, a connected global problem, that where the soils are kind of running out. That's what we're up to.
Thanks, Neil.
Neil, I think you're going to be asked to be an agricultural advisor on a future episode of The Archers, where they're going to be spreading this stuff. And
it has been done for a long time, actually, and the technology's there because farmers often spread chalk, effectively calcium carbonate, to modify the pH of the soil, and that has a similar effect, but it doesn't last as long. If you do it with basalt, it's longer lasting.
Interesting.
Cool. And Derek, have you got a
Okay, in terms of where things are going, certainly wind energy has been quite phenomenal, certainly in Britain. when I first started, there was zero wind energy, and in the last decade, it's grown enormously. So that last year in the UK, just under 25% of electricity was coming from wind. And I think most of the electricity on Christmas Day was coming from wind, plus some other renewables, which is interesting. But solar has also been moving on. I think last year it was about almost 5% of the UK electricity. But what's interesting is how those two technologies have become so much more cost effective, and their efficiency has been increasing, and that power output has been increasing. Certainly photovoltaics was very, very expensive when we first started looking at renewables, but it's now the cheapest source of electricity in many parts of the world. But in terms of resources, Britain is well endowed with wind energy. 40% of the potential land-based wind energy in Europe is actually in the UK. And then offshore is obviously a huge potential, and that's been much more successful than we thought it would be, and it's proving to be less expensive than we thought it would be. And once you're offshore, you can actually increase the size of the turbines, so you're not limited by the road. So they're now currently installing 13 megawatt turbines in Dogger Bank, so that's going to be 200-meter blade diameters. And the other interesting area in wind which is happening is floating wind. There's about 30 projects around the world where they're looking at floating wind energy. And there's an offshore project in Scotland of 5 floating turbines. And one of those has been the most productive wind turbine to date. That enables you to open up deep water, and they reckon that the resource around British waters using floating and seabed technology could well be approaching Gulf oil reserves, but every year, which just shows you the potential. And I think when you combine that with the advantages of energy storage, which has also been following a similar reduction path of solar, then I think the 100% renewables from electricity certainly becomes a much more feasible proposition than we even thought it would be just a short time ago. The other area which I think is interesting from the point of view of heating and cooling is tapping into various ambient energy flows and temperature gradients. And I think we can then use that to store energy from, well, certainly thermal energy and cooling from winter to summer, which is interesting. And so you've got greenhouses in Holland which are actually taking the heat out in the summertime and then using them to heat it in the wintertime. So, and in Denmark, they have these big interseasonal solar district heating systems. So the solar is sitting on top of a big water tank, and then you can heat the houses in the wintertime. I think heating is going to be one of the big challenges, and just saying, oh, insulate all the houses is tricky. When certainly in the UK, we've got 20 million houses, and somehow that's got to be paid for. And often you can actually create more problems than you solve if you don't do it correctly. In terms of the other renewables, I think tidal streams look particularly interesting in the appropriate location, and because the water is 800 times denser than air, the size of rotor is much smaller than the wind turbine, and that seems to be making progress. Whether tidal barrages are feasible, I don't know, because they can disrupt or potentially disrupt local ecosystems in the estuaries, which are quite diverse, but we'll have to see. Although there has been one successfully operating in France for several decades now, which has been quite successful as far as I know. Wave energy, it's a huge resource. It's very tricky. The best resource is off the coast of Scotland, so you have to survive stormy seas 24/7, get the power to Scotland, and then that brings another pylon system from Scotland to England. So we'll see. Scotland looks like it's going to be achieving 100% renewable energy electricity this year. So that's a good progress. And obviously the other technologies, which I think geothermal, not so much in the UK, although there's pockets where it can make sense. And they're certainly looking at the Eden project to actually utilize that. And there's some very interesting technology applying oil rig drilling technology where you can go down much deeper, and I think you can then put in district heating and electricity with that sort of technology. But the other thing is just using local ground coupled energy where you're actually not going down particularly deep, but the temperature of the earth stays pretty stable and so you can utilize that for cooling or heating, combining it with or without heat pumps, and that's interesting technology. But of course, it does mean groundworks have to be dealt with, and whereas going to replace all these gas boilers is going to be tricky. I think that may require we have to have a phase of district heating, but that's not been very popular in the UK, although there was an interesting district heating combined heat and power system running from Battersea Power Station, which was heating 4,000 homes in Pimlico, and they built this great big huge water tank which looks like a gasometer, I think in the 60s, and it's still functioning, and they're still operating as a combined heat and power system, but they have a smaller system. So there's all the kinds of tunes we can play, but we need to find a way to get there.
Great, thanks all of you for a nice broad introduction to everything. So move on to a few questions. So we had a few questions that came in before, which I'll go on to those before look at the ones in the chat. So perhaps for Stephen first. So a lot of the chat so far has been about energy, but what about other emissions? Are there other emissions in the system that we need to worry about apart from just energy? You're muted, I think, Stephen, or is it just me? Yeah.
My pound in the charity box. There are other emissions, of course, and I focused on energy in my career, and that's where my expertise is. And I mentioned in the slide in the beginning that there were these other. It's not just carbon dioxide from burning fossil fuels, but it's carbon dioxide from cement production, it's carbon dioxide from agriculture, it's methane, it's nitrous oxide, and it's these very powerful per unit weight industrial F gases. So Neil's probably going to be better explaining that how that balance changes between, if we're successful at energy, then the agricultural stuff becomes more important. Do you want to say something, Neil?
Well, the agricultural emissions are a really important source, but there's a lot of work going on that already too. I don't know if any of you watched the Year to Change the World Greta Thunberg series recently, but in that we looked at how people are working on changing the feed for cattle, for instance, to reduce methane emissions from cattle. And it can be done, and there are technologies to do that reduce that quite significant methane source. What else? Process emissions from, you mentioned cement manufacture, steel manufacture is another one, and those are things that that there's lots of possibilities to reduce those emissions, but basically we're not as far forward yet as we are with energy. So energy was kind of the big one, so everybody's focused on that first, and as you and Derek have made very clear, a lot of people have been working on it for decades, and we're finally seeing the fruit of that now. So energy emissions are going to start to come down very rapidly, but really as a result of decades of work. And what we now need to do is look ahead and start work now on these remaining sources of emissions that are going to become the dominant ones in a couple of decades' time. And if we don't do that, then we won't be ready to make sure we can hit net zero by wiping out these other emissions when we need to. It's very possible, but it needs work now.
Yeah, there's been quite a lot of development in alternatives to Portland cement, concrete. Obviously, the Romans actually had a different kind of cement and concrete, which is still surviving with the Pantheon. And if we can utilize that type of concrete, then I think that's another way to go. But one of the issues has been that because the structural design codes that structural engineers have to follow hasn't been allowing for these new cements in the concrete, but there's been a reluctance to actually utilize them. But that finally seems to be changing this year. So these standards should hopefully be coming in. But even then, you could still build buildings which are not structurally critical with the new types of cements. And there's quite a few which look very interesting, and there are even some which will actually absorb carbon during the life of the concrete's operation. So it becomes a net carbon system, which is interesting. And I think also it can be a bit clever on how you actually design structurally. So you use more arches and things, then you don't need so much material, and you don't need to use the steel reinforcement, which is a big component of the embodied carbon in concrete, as well as the cement. And of course you can mix and match different aggregates. So I think there's a lot of potential. And also I think there's utilizing things like stabilized soil blocks and things, instead of using the whole concrete, that you can actually just use a very small amount of material to actually give the performance you need. And there's certainly been examples of that in the past, but that's not happened really because the similar things with the structural codes has not really been allowing them. But there was a reluctance to use that type of material. But I think there's possibilities.
And I think there's a move to go back to using more wood as well, is there not? And even in big skyscrapers, I think I've...
Yes, that is certainly possible. I think there's been huge developments in the whole engineering performance of timber in the last decade, and they can make use of material which was not able to be used in the past. And it's just like using very giant plywood, really. And
so trees can be a carbon neutral technology, or more or less carbon neutral. So if you grow a tree, it sucks CO2 from the atmosphere. And if you burn it, the CO2 goes back to the atmosphere. Roughly, overall, a neutral process. But if you grow the tree and process the wood and put it in a building, and if the building lasts for 200 or 300 years and isn't burned or doesn't burn down, then the wood, the carbon that you've taken out of the atmosphere, is being stored in the building. So that is a negative emissions technology.
Absolutely.
And as you say, there's by replacing some uses of steel and concrete with wood, sustainably grown wood, then we are sucking carbon out of the atmosphere.
Yeah, and if you build in sort of post and beam technology, so I think that's the way to go forward. And they're very protective in fire situations as well. So you could replace steel frames with modern timber frames like that, and you're halfway there in that regard.
I think one of the best academic job adverts I ever saw a few years ago was a chair in wood technology. Chair in wood, somewhere in Switzerland. So it's an active area of research.
Okay, we're getting lots of questions coming in. I'll just ask one more quickly that was discussed before, came in before, and then I'll move straight into the ones that are coming in. So I think probably goes to Neil, and you've talked about this a little bit, but is there a risk? So we talked about, aside from renewables, there are negative emissions technologies. Is there a risk that by focusing too much on negative emissions, we're distracting from the more important task of reducing emissions quickly now?
Great. Well, that's a really good question, because that's been a big worry for a long time. And indeed, Steve and I had a long argument about this when we were warming up for this show. And I think the important thing, like I just said, is that the huge reduction in the real big emissions, which are from energy still, is starting to happen now, and it's happening now because of all the work that has been done over the last 2 or 3 decades. The point is that is now going to come into play. That is going to lead to very big reductions in emissions over the next decade. It's already doing so. What's then going to happen, if you throw your mind back to Steve's graph at the beginning, is we're going to end up at a state where the important emissions are these residual emissions from agriculture, from buildings, from industrial processes, and they're going to be the big remaining ones. And if we don't do the research now to make sure that we're ready for that, we won't be ready. We won't be able to do it when we need it in 10, 20 years' time. And indeed, we need to roll those things out, in fact, and start scaling them up and get those economies of scale as soon as possible, because it's really the economies of scale that have made the energy emissions possible to reduce. So as Derek mentioned, the cost of solar has just plummeted in a way that nobody really expected, because of massive economies of scale. And that's really tipped us over the edge in a way that we want to go over the edge, which is that, as Derek mentioned, it's now cheaper to use renewable energy than it is fossil energy in most parts of the world already. And once you get to that point, the momentum is unstoppable. It's just going to take over, and it will take over probably very fast. We'll go over a threshold, and this is how it can actually destabilize the financial system. But I think the reason one of the things that's confusing about that is you think, well, what should we be focusing on? Should we be focusing on this, or should we be focusing on that? And the reason that's slightly fallacious is that who's we, right? The question is who we is. And what I'm suggesting is that a big part of the scientific community, the research community, the R&D community needs to be focusing now on solutions for 20 years' time. So that's one lot of we. We need to be doing that. And other actors in the system, politicians, public, need to be focusing on different things. So if you're a politician, you need to be incentivizing the research, you need to be incentivizing the research for a decade's time, but you need to be incentivizing public actions for things that are already available. So for instance, it's critical that we make electric vehicles comparable in cost with fossil vehicles. And the countries that have done that have already gone over the edge of that threshold into a massive take-up of electric vehicles, because they've put in enough policies in place to incentivize the public to make that switch. And if it's cheaper, people just buy it. So politicians need to be doing certain things, public needs to be doing certain things, researchers need to be doing certain things. So there's not just one we that represents everybody. That's part of the answer to your question.
Yeah, we should move on to some of these questions now. They're building up. We need to get, and we've got one that's kind of tied in with the answer you just gave, but I think probably directed to Derek. So has contracts for difference done its job? The first part of the question. This comes from Yvonne. And the second part of the question is, what else could be done to support UK renewables?
Well,
can you explain what contract for difference is first, for those who don't, who never quite got the hang of it?
Derek, off you go.
No,
from Yvonne. Can Yvonne explain contracts for difference?
No, but basically, I think it's really like an auction, and that seems to be the way that it seems to be functioning. But because now you're not really subsidizing in the same way, it's more of a competitive thing. And I think it's obviously helped to even I think in the Dutch sector of the offshore, that they actually came in so much cheaper, even on offshore turbines, because of that approach. But interesting. I think one of the things which obviously needs is the planning policies need to be changed so they're not negative to lots of these things, and not just in terms of wind energy. At one time there was actually a policy for no more wind turbines, although it coincided at the time when over 90% of the UK population were supportive of wind. So that's now been rescinded, but it'll be interesting to see what happens since. But I think also in terms of the whole retrofit business of how you actually upgrade buildings, a lot of the most effective way to do that is going to be external insulation and that sort of thing, which is obviously going to change the outside appearance. And so the planners are going to have to be much more amenable to that sort of rapid change, which is going to be needed if we're really going to attack 20 million homes. It's a big policy. I think probably just getting out of the way of some of the things which are impeding renewable energy development. But I think as we get down to more renewables, there's going to be issues about how we build buildings and what materials we use. So we're going to have to be much more careful about the embodied carbon. So that sort of policy needs to be as part of the building regulations, so that the actual materials which are being used are also helping. The passive house system is actually materials agnostic, and it's focused on the physical performance of the buildings. So we probably need to take that approach further, but maybe being more specific about some of the materials, which particularly insulation. A lot of insulation is plastic foam derived from fossil fuels. So that's obviously a big factor. And you can argue that it's better to use it with insulation than burn it, but I don't know. And one of the reasons it's been used so much is because it's for the same amount of insulation, it's much thinner. So, and there's big industries capitalizing it, and so they can do.
Can I jump in, Derek, and say I want to try and answer everyone's question. Contracts for Difference is the latest way of a 2 or 3 decade story in which the UK government has tried to incentivize low carbon energy sources onto the grid. And there have been many other policies that have been trying to do that. The Contracts for Difference is what we do now, but it was on the back of NFFO policies, many other policies going back decades. And you have to be like a real policy wonk kind of person to read. And lots of people enjoy this stuff. Policies are like little animals. Think of them as inhabiting a fish tank. And you sort of slightly forget about the policies swimming around in the fish tank, and you look back a few minutes later, and there's lots of little other policies that have arrived, baby policies, or maybe some of the policies have swallowed the other policies. There's a big sharky policy in the way, and so policies inhabit their own slightly autonomous world where they actually, curiously, in a sort of AI sort of way, they design each other. They procreate with each other. They rub along with each other, rub against each other. And we like to think the government is all powerful, all knowing, all serious, kind of in charge, playing the orchestra of policy. Well, that's rubbish. The orchestra has got a mind of its own and is making all sorts of tunes independent of us. And the field of renewable energy support policies in the UK is a classic example. And we can help. The question is, how can we help? We can help by educating our ministers and our industrial leaders and our public to some extent to be requesting the right level of policy intervention, and not too often and not too confusingly, and to keep a steady course on that ship on industrial policy and stop messing around with petty politics on the micro details of policies, because we're talking about developing industrial policies to try to limit the Earth's temperature. It's not about party politics scoring, which it has been, unfortunately, for some time. So policies work, but you cannot specify them in too much detail at too frequently. And the Contracts for Difference is making a difference at the moment, but it's on the back of a very long story of policy intervention in British renewable energy. Thank you, Yvonne, for your question.
So this one is directed to Stephen as well. So on your data, you're talking about the amount of energy that was available from solar, etc., and there are very large uncertainties. I mean, the question here is, why is there such a huge range of uncertainty between the estimates that were given in your presentation?
That's an excellent question. That is because the honest answer is that in the literature, so these are IPCC figures based on their assessment of what's in the literature. So if you go off in the literature and you say, how many studies have been done for how much energy could we get from solar technologies, you get a really, really wide range of results from the academics that do the studies, because they make different assumptions about the cost. They make different assumptions about the availability of land. They make different assumptions about which, are you talking about massive photovoltaic farms, Are you talking about concentrated solar power stations with rings of mirrors focusing on a giant tower of boiling hot molten salt? They all cost different things. They all have their pluses and minuses. And those particular figures, as I understand it, from a detailed reading of the IPCC report on renewable energy, which is where they came from, is that those figures are by just using 2% of available land surface. So it's not about covering the earth in technologies at all, or the ocean. It's just using 2% of available land, and the more that's in sunny equatorial regions where the concentration of sunlight is much greater than towards the poles, then you need even less land. So there's a huge range, because it's a very, very uncertain business, even scientifically and technically, answering that question. So I was trying to be fair and just give the mid-range, but I hope it's clear from those numbers, and if you go and look at the report yourself, I hope it's clear that there is more than enough sunlight falling on the earth each day for us to power the earth. In fact, it's just over an hour's worth of sunlight to power the earth for a year if you captured it all. And so there's a vast amount of solar energy incident on the earth, and that drives, not just directly by capturing it in photovoltaic panels or large concentrated solar power stations, but it also drives the winds, it also drives the ocean currents, and it drives some of the shallow heat recovery that Derek was talking about. So yes, there's a large uncertainty because that's science and that's technology, and that's what the literature says.
Yeah, and in Britain, certainly the solar is much better than people would imagine. Certainly, a decade ago, they reckoned that the average UK house roof was enough to provide the electricity needs of the house. And I did a study for Uttlesford, which is one of the districts in Essex, a while ago, and that has the Stansted Airport. And we looked at if we put solar collectors, solar PV canopies over the car parking in Stansted Airport, and they would generate 17% of the electricity needs for the houses in that district. So it is phenomenal.
Okay, thanks. A question from Neil, I think it's probably best. You sort of touched on this a bit earlier, but this question from Keith, who says, doesn't achieving net zero require collaboration and cooperation rather than private enterprise? I guess this kind of comes back to
well, I think what we've seen with the renewable energy is what's really brought the cost down is this massive economies of scale. So that the massive decrease in cost of solar PV, which has made this huge difference to what's possible, as Derek was saying, you can now generate so much more PV by capturing sunlight than we believe was possible a decade ago. So what's driven that? There is collaboration that's important, but there's no question that big companies are making a lot of money, and they need to be big companies making a lot of money to make that work. So there's certainly a lot of enterprise, and there's I mean, I shudder to think how many startups and private enterprises are pushing different new ideas for different kinds of energy efficient, energy saving devices and energy systems at the moment. This is a huge ecosystem of entrepreneurs and startups, and that without that it just wouldn't happen. But you do need cooperation as well, and the things that are really where cooperation really comes in is standards. and agreeing standards internationally that allow things to be used globally, and because that permits the economies of scale. And there's also cooperation about, say, carbon taxes and those kind of measures. If you do that on a larger scale internationally, that makes a huge difference. So cooperation, political cooperation internationally plays a big role, but entrepreneurial activity too, I think, both essential.
There's also potential with community-owned renewables, so that people get together and they develop their own.
Yeah, that's another really good point.
That was struggling for quite a while, because in the UK climate, everything had to be competitive with the commercial projects, so it was struggling. There's been a few. There's one very successful one near Oxford, about 5 or so wind turbines and the solar farms as well. And I think if we can make those sorts of things much easier to do, so that people can get the expertise to help them to do it, I think that could be a big step forward. So if every other village had its own wind turbine, for instance, or every other town had a wind farm, and that would certainly give ownership to those people, and then they actually engage with the whole thing as well. So there is a role for it, but obviously up until now it's been driven by the economics, although the solar really became more cost effective because of the policies in Germany in the early days, where they actually did very big feed-in towers and that was enough to actually encourage the big scale up of factories. And of course then the Chinese benefited from the Australian research, where one of the people did some very innovative research in Australia and set up one of the biggest solar companies in the world, and they've drove the cost down, and the efficiency keeps going up at the same time. So the efficiency, now you can buy a solar panel now which is over 22% efficient, and there's some which looking at that they're approaching 30% in not too distant future, whereas 10 years ago we were looking at 10-15%.
Right. So while you're here, Derek, here's a question from Rich directed at you. There's been a lot of mention of air source heat pumps in the media recently. Do you think this technology will be useful for achieving net zero in the UK?
I think it can make a contribution. The issues often are air source heat pumps are necessarily inappropriately installed, so they often be installed by people who don't understand what they're necessarily doing. The air source heat pumps are not as efficient as ground source heat pumps because their source temperature is obviously varying much more, whereas in the ground it stays constant. The way a heat pump works is the more efficient they are, it's the difference between the source temperature, in other words the air, and the temperature you're required to heat. If that's as small as possible, then the efficiency goes down, increases. Whereas obviously if you're talking about freezing temperatures, then it becomes more of a challenge. But there are some new technology heat pumps which can achieve such higher efficiency using different kinds of refrigerants, and so that's possible. The size of, if you're replacing an existing boiler, it is tricky because often the house has not been very well insulated, so it's going to be a struggle for an air source heat pump to deliver that. What you can do, or we've encouraged in certain cases, is what we call a bivalent system. So you actually size the heat pump for what the house demand would be after you've insulated, and you continue to use your boiler for the times when the heat pump isn't able to deliver. So that might be one transition forward, but you need to have much lower heat demand for heat pumps to be viable, particularly air source heat pumps. I think you can do a ground source, but you then need to build larger collectors or more boreholes, and that the cost of that has come down. Again, another factor in the equation, which is interesting. And the interesting with using ground sources, you can actually use that for cooling in the summertime. So you actually deposit the heat from the building to cool the building, to actually warm up the air, warm up the soil. So I think air source heat pumps can be an opportunity, but they need to be done carefully, and people need to know what they're doing.
Okay, well, there's 4 minutes left, so I think it's probably a good time for a question that could be directed at all three of you, so you can take it one at a time. And it's from Keith again. And he's asked, do you feel optimistic about COP26? So who wants to go first? Stephen? Sorry, you might be muted.
Thank you very much, Keith. Do I feel optimistic? I've always felt the UNFCCC process, the COP process, is like watching a child grow up. I first held the child in my arms at COP3 when I joined the UNFCCC, and the child was just stumbling around, learning how to walk, a toddler, a terrible toddler, and learned to do integration and differentiation when COP12, COP13. The child is now in COP26, so an adult, but still not terribly wise of the world. And it just goes on. The clue is in the question. COP26, there will be a COP50. So people always expect too much of any particular COP that is coming up, and they do it because they start banging the drums, and it's very convenient for the host country to sort of show off their credentials and to get everybody going. And it's just a constant kind of sort of drum banging sort of ritual. And it almost always ends with people really quite dissatisfied with the outcome. Sometimes every 70 years or so, there's a kind of hype cycle with it. You get a Copenhagen or you get a Paris, and you do kind of get a breakthrough. But even then, the media reports of what is actually agreed, the media reports of it and what actually went on, there's often a very big gap. So we're all being sort of manipulated to some extent by a caravan of media frenzy around any COP. So for this particular COP, I don't have very high hopes, I have to say, but that doesn't mean to say I'm not optimistic for the future, because I don't think it revolves around a single COP. It revolves around a sort of a longer term cycle. And in that sense, I am really optimistic, but I think the challenges that we face are really serious, and we need to not rest on our laurels. Yes, solar power is the cheapest electricity we've ever had. Yes, the wind industry is the biggest it's ever been, but we need a wind industry globally that is 10 times the size it is today in 20 years. I need a solar industry which is 20 times the size it is in 20 years. As well as these exotic negative emissions, carbon capture, utilization, storage, funky scientific stuff that we've got to develop as well. I need all of it, and I need it now. And the best way of getting that is to stop wasting energy so that the renewable industries that we're developing now, so that they can cope. And the biggest thing I want to say to people watching today is, please don't take energy, and particularly electricity, for granted. We've done it for far too long. And we really collectively must stop wasting energy. And my rant is over.
Thank you. And Neil, we're really short on time, but would you like to?
Really short. Well, I'll just say cautiously optimistic. Yeah. So what was really lucky is that it had to be put off a year, because there's absolutely no doubt it would have been a total utter car crash if it had been last year, because the government were just not even thinking about it. But they've now had 2 years to prepare, which is very fortunate.
And Derek, you optimistic? Well, yes and no. I suppose I'm optimistic in terms of seeing more help in terms of getting more and more renewables. And as Stephen said, we need to have even more of a game change, even though there's about 750,000 gigawatts of installed wind last year, and not far behind that was solar globally. So it's getting there, but it is the low-hanging fruit, I suppose. So we need to make sure we actually keep the momentum going. And we also need to look at energy efficiency, and much more. I think we also need to be looking at how we can actually deal with, or help and deal with, embodied carbon.
Brilliant. Well, thanks everyone. That's bang on time. So I guess that's a good time to say thank you. Thanks to all three of you, and thanks to everyone for coming along and joining in and providing lots of